Welcome to My Favorite Mystic, a podcast about the weird and wonderful world of mysticism. I'm AJ Langley, and today I'm joined by Lydia Shahan. She's a second-year PhD student in the study of religion at Harvard University. She looks at mysticism and devotional literature in the medieval Low Countries and Northern Europe, focusing on expressions of gender and sexuality, with particular attention paid to the language of reproduction and spiritual pregnancy. Lydia, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so good to see you.
It's great to see you too. So today you're here to speak to us about a mystic with one of the least pronounceable names, Hadewijch.
I saw a tweet once that any conference on medieval devotional stuff, there are as many pronunciations of Hadewijch as there are participants. But that's as correct as I can do it.
Well, your pronunciation is infinitely better than anything I could do, so we're going with that one. But before we get into her, tell us a little bit more about you. How did you first get interested in mysticism as a field of study?
I came to mysticism through the study of history. So sometimes I feel, especially being in a PhD program in religious studies, that I came to this discipline in general and my particular research interests through a somewhat circuitous route. So I studied medieval history as an undergraduate, and I was just immediately captivated by religious texts. And I think as an 18, 19-year-old, a lot of this was really just because, as anyone who studies medieval history knows, these are some of the areas in which the most vibrant writings by women are found. So in my first year of college, I was just really searching around for a topic for a final paper, and I somehow stumbled on Margaret Peret's The Mirror of Simple Souls, which I had no context for this incredibly complicated text. I really had no framework for understanding this theologically, even in terms of the historical context, but I was really hooked by the language of paradox in particular, which I'll talk a little more about later. So I really started studying mystical literature more seriously from that point on. And ultimately, I did my master's at the KU Leuven in Belgium to study Flemish mysticism. I really had the opportunity to specialize in mysticism of the medieval Low Countries with Professor Rob Fazen, a world expert on Hadewijch. So I had been introduced to her before, but that's where I really had the opportunity to dive deeply into her work.
Do you remember your first introduction to her text and what it was about her that drew you in?
I think I read her initially in Oxford, where I studied abroad in college. And I think in the English translation, it doesn't fully come through, but this poetic language and the language of love and this push me, pull you desperation almost that characterizes some of her poetry, I think just was really captivating because at that time I was still really new to this kind of genre of literature, and it felt so desperate, so raw, so personal in a certain way that I was really captivated. And now I'm actually a lot more interested in her visions, but I think it was the poems or the songs, actually the leader in, that initially grabbed me.
Well, I am ready to be equally captivated. So let's move to talking about her. What do we know about her life?
That's very easy to summarize because we basically know nothing autobiographically. So Hadewijch was probably active in the first half of the 13th century, before about 1250, in what is now Flanders, so in Brabant, in what is now Belgium. There have been other theories about both of these things that I've just said, but that's the consensus as far as we can understand it now.
These other theories, is one of them the reason that we sometimes see her referred to as Hadewijch of Antwerp?
Yeah, I think that this is definitely an interesting misnomer. I believe that actually comes from a much later manuscript inscription that calls her Hadewijch d'Anvers, so from Antwerp. But I know from experts that I've spoken to who really look at the philology of her Middle Dutch language, that it seems much more likely that in terms of the dialect that she's writing in, it hews much more closely to the area of Brabant than to an Antwerp dialect. So I think people are really desperate to assign some more specificity to this person about whom we know almost nothing, but I don't think that there's a lot of internal evidence for the Antwerp location. And describe who was writing this in the later Middle Ages, I don't think necessarily had any more information about where she was actually from than we do.
Okay, so Brabant, not Antwerp. What else do we know?
Yeah, so we don't really know anything about her biography, especially because the surviving manuscripts of her work, so she produced writing in 4 genres, so letters, poems in stanzas, which are actually originally songs or liederen, poems in couplets, or they're called mengeldikten or mixed poems in Dutch, and a series of visions. So this corpus is actually quite stable. So most of the manuscripts that we have preserves or passes down basically all of this writing as a corpus by the same person. But these manuscripts only date from the 14th century, so about a century after we believe Hadewijch to have been active and to have been writing. So from what we can tell in the internal evidence, she's often assumed to be a Beguine. This is probably the most likely explanation. There have been other theories put forth, including by Professor Fazen, that she could have been a Cistercian nun as well. Certainly she's extremely familiar with Cistercian theology and some writings by key Cistercian figures like William of Saint-Thierry and Bernard of Clairvaux. But even if she had an affiliation or an interest in the Cistercian order, she doesn't necessarily have had to have been a member of that order. And in this period, in the early 13th century, there's a huge amount of flexibility that we see from the lives of women that we do know more about, where people are living as a kind of freelance holy woman or a Beguine, later entering a monastic order, sometimes switching monastic orders. So I think some combination of these things is probably the most likely.
And in this period, the term begging can mean a lot of different things as well.
Absolutely. Beguine life in the early 13th century looks so different from what it became later. It's much less formal. I mean, if you've spent time in Belgium, in Flanders in particular, and I encourage everyone to go do this because these are such beautiful places and beautiful structures. But if you go to Leuven or Ghent or Bruges, you can see these Beguine courts that are really, they call them, the city within the city. So they are really these entire neighborhoods of these beguinages, but that's almost always dating from a lot later. Maybe people started living there in the 13th century, but these court beguinages that we see and that sometimes people really visually associate with the earlier Beguine literature is actually from a much later period. So however she would have identified herself, she's probably living as a Beguine or as a holy woman in a way that's a lot less structured than we might assume. So then you might ask, how can we assign this name to this person, or even say that this corpus is by one person at all?
Attributing texts to medieval authors is always a tricky subject, but in the case of mystics, it tends to be particularly fraught. So yeah, how do we know in Hadewijch's case? Is her name mentioned in the texts?
Her name is not in the text. It's ascribed to the manuscripts later. But we do know that she's quoted anonymously in the writings of Rusbroek, who's a 14th century author a little bit later. So he quotes her quite extensively, and his theology draws a lot on her writings, even though he doesn't name her. It's also in a corpus of mystical sermons that I'm also interested in and have done some work on, the Limburg sermons from around 1300. And a less known reference, at least in the English-speaking world, and this comes courtesy of my colleague and our friend John Arblaster, is that Jan van Leeuwen, a contemporary and disciple of Rusbroek's at the Priory of Groenendaal outside of Brussels in the Estonian forest, actually does name Hadewijch. And he actually calls her Beata Hadewijch and even Sancta Hadewijch. So blessed Hadewijch and Saint Hadewijch. So from that, we really do have evidence that people are reading this writing in the 14th century in the area of Brussels, and that they are ascribing it to a figure called Hadewijch. And Jan van Leeuwen actually says that she's even more difficult to understand than Paul. So some high praise from her fans at Groenendaal.
I mean, you say high praise, I say, what a backhanded compliment. But thanks to them, we know that she existed, and we have this corpus. So let's talk a little bit more about the texts. You mentioned that there are 4 different genres. Can you remind us what they are and tell us a bit about them?
Yeah, so we have this corpus of 4 genres of writing: the letters, the liederen, devotional songs, and the mengeldikten, the mixed poems. and a series of visions. And I would say that all these genres of writing, there's a real cohesion in their themes, and all of them are highly mystical. So the central point of each of these genres is the personal encounter and relationship with God in all its facets. So joy, reverence, fear, despair, hopelessness, love. And love is a very key theme, and the divine or God is usually referred to in these writings as minne. So the Middle Dutch word for love is usually how Hadewijch personifies God or the figure of the divine. She will also talk about Christ, but by and large, she's really much more often talking about minne. And in terms of the autobiographical content, her writings are really very rarely autobiographical. She sprinkles in a few, nuggets of personal information here and there, but she's really not interested in writing about herself in a historical sense. Occasionally, she will preface the vision with a description of her setting or her surroundings. She seems to have often received visions in church during a liturgical service, as we know that a lot of other mystics and holy women from this period did. So some people have really tried to pull out some more autobiographical information in the way that she talks about her suffering or her trials. She will sometimes talk about being part of what seems to be a small group from which she was then exiled. She talks a lot about being exiled. And there are some people who have really run with this and tried to build a theory that, Hadewijch is a leader of a small group, of a small religious group or sort of mystical company, and then she's later exiled from this role. I think the way she's talking about exile is very poetic and has a lot more to do with her inner and her spiritual state, which doesn't preclude a historical connection or a connection with her historical circumstances. But I don't think there's enough textual evidence to say anything more about that than what's in the texts, which is describing a period of isolation and anguish that stems from being exiled or being separated from some people or persons that she was very closely connected with.
I love that. Even when we think we might have a little bit more biographical information, we're wrong. So we clearly don't know much about her, but is she well known to us? Is there a lot of scholarship on Hadewijch?
Hadewijch is really well known in two camps that sometimes intersect, but don't always intersect. So people who study medieval mysticism know Hadewijch. She's become increasingly well known in the English-speaking world since 1980, when the translation of her complete works was made into English. Before that, she was mainly and has long been studied in Belgium and Flanders as a native holy person and as one of the crown jewels of medieval Dutch literature and early Dutch literature in general. So, she was initially sort of discovered and studied by Flemish Jesuits, and a lot of the really important critical work on Hadewijch was done by philologists, but who were also Jesuits, so who had a really keen understanding and very deep interest in the mystical content as well. And this translation was produced by Columba Hart as part of a movement influenced by feminist scholarship to uncover and bring into historical and theological conversation religious writings by women, or this sort of phrase that I hate, but is sometimes useful, by and about women, which are obviously completely different things, but often get lumped together. And yeah, I think the rediscovery of Hadewijch has produced incredibly important, incredibly interesting work. I think some both theological and feminist readings of Hadewijch run the risk of decontextualizing the text. And sometimes that's what you want to do. And that, that's completely fine, as long as we're aware that that's what we're doing, right? And I do think that Hadewijch's anonymity really does contribute to this, because we don't have a library, we don't have a community, we don't have a biography. And so there isn't a lot of context that you can hang your hat on. And so we do see some wild assumptions getting made about her biography that aren't really supported by the internal evidence. And I think the fact that Middle Dutch is not especially accessible, and Hadewijch's Middle Dutch in particular is hard, is challenging, And the fact that that original text isn't accessible to a lot of people who are working on her in English also can contribute to that risk of decontextualization. And I think one thing that I always want to do in my work or in my thinking and talking with other people about her is to make sure that in the English-speaking world, the work of these early philologists and early theologians is not ignored and is not left uncited. But there's also some incredibly interesting work. I would think of the work of Patricia Daly at Columbia, who does read the Dutch as well. And she really treats the literary, theological, and philosophical references and from a very strong theoretical perspective, very strong feminist perspective, while also really having a lot of respect and a lot of knowledge for what's in the text. And I've referenced him several times already, but Rob Fazen at KU Leuven literally wrote the book on desire in Hadewijch, Begeerte in het werk van Hadewijch, is his monograph, which is absolutely essential, and is also someone who's, in the contemporary scholarship on Hadewijch, who is really producing incredible work. And I think outside of academic circles, Hadewijch isn't really well known, and that's again just because we don't have context. You can't, like with Hildegard of Bingen, you can't go visit her monastery. You can't go see any pictures of her. There's no iconography. There's no context, which is a shame, but the texts also do speak for themselves, and we are lucky to just have the texts. So,
well, as medievalists, sometimes we just have to be thankful for whatever we can get our hands on.
We do.
And I mean, luckily, in Hadewijch's case, what we have is a rather large corpus. So what kind of things is she talking about in her works?
All of these writings are dealing with this primary relationship between God and the individual soul, love and the individual soul. The thing that I love about Hadewijch's work is that it's extremely cohesive without being particularly systematic. So obviously people have written a lot about the theology of Hadewijch. She has a very complicated, very interesting theology, but there's nowhere in her texts where you can point to and say, this is what she believes, about the Trinity. This is what she believes about X. Her works are not systematic treatments. And it's hard to compile a synthesis of her theology from these writings, even though they are deeply theological and they're very pedagogical. She's always writing in order to help someone else to understand. And I always think of Hadewijch's writings as a kaleidoscope or as kaleidoscopic. So each poem, each letter or vision is just a different prism that sheds light on this relationship from a different angle. So in the poems, the Liederen, for example, we get a lot of courtly imagery, a lot of imagery of Hadewijch or the narrator as a knight who's trying to win the hand of love, of Minna. In the visions, we get a lot of abyss imagery from the Psalms, a lot of apocalyptic imagery, and there are other literary genres that she plays with. And she really seems to have been an incredibly well-educated woman, both in terms of her religious education. She's deeply familiar with scripture and with 12th century mystical religious writings. And she's also seemingly quite familiar with secular or courtly literature as well. So there's a lot to sort through.
So she's well educated and uses a lot of courtly language. Normally that results in the female mystic being classified as a bridal mystic. Do we have a lot of bridal mysticism language in her work?
That's a good question. I think she would normally be included in compilations of bridal mysticism. And there is definitely this courtly connection. I mean, I think what's interesting is that she does use a lot of language from the Song of Songs. In terms of the courtly references in the Liederen, it's actually gender reversed. She's actually the knight who's trying to conquer and win the heart of Minna or love. And Minna is a feminine noun in Middle Dutch. So I don't want to make too much of this because I think it really mostly does come down to grammar, but we are using a feminized noun for God, and we are using she pronouns for Minna because that's just how Dutch works, is you use gendered pronouns a lot more often than we do in English for inanimate objects or concepts. So I think that there are aspects of what you could call bridal mysticism in Hadewijch, but she's not usually describing herself as being wed to Christ. There's less erotic language, less language of consummation than in some other examples that we could think of. There is some, but I don't think her focus is usually on herself as a bride. And I am skeptical sometimes of the utility of trying to sort mystical texts into categories like bridal mysticism or intellectual mysticism. I just think we end up having so many exceptions to each of these categories so as to render the categories themselves somewhat useless.
I love to render a category useless.
She gets it.
So you mentioned that you have a passage of hers that you want to share.
Yeah, so I'm going to read a little passage from Vision 7, which is called by the editors Oneness in the Eucharist, although I don't think that's an original subtitle. And Vision 7 is the keystone of the series of 13 to 14 visions. So it comes right in the middle. And I think that it's really beautiful. I mean, this is in the English, but I think you really feel some of the themes, particularly of desire and of suffering and of the twinned nature of desire and suffering, such that desire is always about a lack, and that are really woven throughout Hadewijch.
That sounds great. Let's hear it.
On a certain Pentecost Sunday, I had a vision at dawn. Matins were being sung in the church, and I was present. My heart and my veins and all my limbs trembled and quivered with eager desire. And as often occurred with me, such madness and fear beset my mind, that it seemed to me I did not content my beloved, and that my beloved did not fulfill my desire, so that dying I must go mad, and going mad I must die. On that day, my mind was beset so fearfully and so painfully by desirous love, that all my separate limbs threatened to break, and all my separate veins were in travail. The longing in which I then was cannot be expressed by any language or any person I know, and everything I could say about it would be unheard of to all those who never apprehended love as something to work for with desire, and whom love had never acknowledged as hers. I can say this about it. I desired to have full fruition of my beloved, and to understand and taste him to the full. I desired that his humanity should to the fullest extent be one in fruition with my humanity, and that mine then should hold its stand and be strong enough to enter into perfection until I content him, who is perfection itself, by purity and unity, and in all things to content him fully in every virtue. To that end, I wished he might content me interiorly with his Godhead, in one spirit, and that for me he should be all that he is, without withholding anything from me. For above all the gifts that I ever longed for, I chose this gift, that I should give satisfaction in all great sufferings, for that is the most perfect satisfaction, to grow up in order to be God with God. So here, we have Hadewijch in this liturgical context on a certain Pentecost Sunday in the church. Matins are being sung, and we just get this incredible picture, again, without revealing a lot about who she is or where she is, what her situation is, but we get this picture that you do feel reading this, that you do know her, and that you can connect with this overpowering desire. And I think it's interesting that her desire is such that she fears not necessarily that she won't content her beloved, but that her beloved isn't going to be enough to satisfy her desire, which I think really speaks to her confidence and to the depth of her desire. And she uses the sensory language of taste. She's anticipating the Eucharist, so that makes sense. But I think it also speaks to just her use of the full sensorium in describing her longing for this relationship.
She does come across very confident, and the language is, as you said, quite poetic and powerful. Thank you for reading that. We are coming to the end of our time, so the only thing left is to ask you the one big question, which is, with all of the mystics you have studied and read, why is Hadewijch still your favorite mystic?
I love this question, and I'm so glad to have the opportunity to think about this and talk about it. There's one answer that I could say that, talks about Hadewijch's theology and her blend between originality and canonicity, her radical vision for the relationship between human and divine. That's both radical, but also deeply informed by a long tradition of mystical thinkers and mystical culture. But personally, and just kind of affectively, I think there's a few things about Hadewijch that keep me coming back. One of those is power. So, if you read a lot of mystical literature, especially writings by women, you tend to get very familiar with what some scholars have termed the humility topos. So, why would any of this come to me? I'm only a vessel, right? Like, I'm just someone who's been chosen to pass on this message. And that definitely is interesting in its own right. But Hadewijch almost never, very rarely engages this kind of humility topos. And I just love that her works truly trade in power. So in Vision 14, she says that God prefers me to all creatures I ever saw.
What a claim.
And, she certainly suffers from a deprivation and a lack of God, but I think it's really interesting that she comes from this perspective of being chosen and of being very powerful. And this power is just so obvious in the confidence, the creativity of her writings. And I think that comes through beautifully. And that power isn't to say that she doesn't suffer. And she describes, especially in the poems, the sacrificing, the suffering that you have to undertake for love. But she always comes back to another quotation, just die Minne es all. So love is everything. And I think that for me and for so many people who've been captivated by this writing, Hadewijch strikes a chord in her ability to capture the range of everything that is beautiful and terrible about love. And I think that makes her writings immortal. Another thing that I love is that the idea that suffering is not a weakness. Hadewijch's suffering never renders her weak. And just the idea that suffering and grief are parts of love and are part of a love relationship. Again, I'm not saying that you should take this or any other mystical text as a model for your personal relationships. That is a disclaimer.
That is a disclaimer that is necessary on so many of these episodes. There is nothing relationship goals about these mystics and God.
Definitely not a healthy relationship.
100% not.
But I think in any relationship, whether between humans, human and divine, there is suffering and there is grief, and relationships can be a lot of things at once. And I've been reading a wonderful essay by Carolyn Walker Bynum on paradox. And she says, paradox is not a method, it is life. And I think that Hadewijch really captures this generative power of paradox and what we gain from seeing how many things can be true at the same time. So that's what keeps me coming back.
Way to end on the most profound of possible notes.
It's all in the text. I claim nothing, so.
Well, Lydia, thank you so much for being here today and for sharing your love of Hadewijch.
Thank you so much for having me. It's just always a pleasure to talk to you, always a pleasure to talk about Hadewijch. So, put those two things together and it's just happiness on happiness.
My heart. Same. Thank you so much. And thank you all for listening. You can follow us on Twitter at MyFaveMystic and join me next time when I speak to Georgia Van Ralta about Dion Fortune.